We stand here today confronting one of the darkest chapters in Australia's modern history. What unfolded yesterday evening at Bondi Beach, one of Australia's most beloved and iconic locations, was not merely a criminal act. It was a calculated act of terrorism that struck at the heart of a community celebrating one of their most cherished holidays. 11 innocent lives were taken. 29 others were wounded. Among the dead, a 12-year-old girl, a rabbi who had served his community for 18 years, a Holocaust survivor who had already witnessed humanity's darkest depths, only to face violence once more in what should have been a place of safety and celebration. The facts are these. Around 6:45 in the evening, as approximately 1,000 people gathered at Archer Park near Bondi Beach for a Hanukkah celebration called Hanukkah by the Sea, at least 2 gunmen opened fire from a footbridge overlooking the event. The attack was deliberate. It was planned. Authorities found improvised explosive devices in a vehicle connected to the attackers. This was an assault designed to maximize casualties and terror within the Jewish community on the first night of Hanukkah, a festival that celebrates light overcoming darkness, hope triumphing over despair. Now we must examine what comes next. The immediate outcomes, the broader implications, and the potential trajectories this tragedy will set in motion for Australia, for the Jewish community worldwide, and for the ongoing struggle against antisemitism that has surged alarmingly since October 2023. Let us begin with the immediate law enforcement and security response. Australian authorities have already designated this as a terrorist incident. 1 gunman was killed at the scene. A second is in critical condition under police custody. Investigators are examining whether a third individual was involved. The FBI has engaged with Australian counterparts, suggesting international dimensions to this investigation. We can expect several immediate developments in the coming hours and days. First, a comprehensive investigation into the attackers' backgrounds, their networks, their radicalization pathways. Reports indicate one suspect may be identified as Naveed Akram, suggesting possible connections that investigators will pursue aggressively. The presence of explosive devices indicates a level of planning and capability that goes beyond spontaneous violence. Authorities will be examining communications, financial records, travel patterns, and any associations with extremist organizations or ideologies. This investigation will likely extend beyond Australia's borders. Second, we will see an immediate and substantial increase in security at Jewish institutions throughout Australia and potentially worldwide. Synagogues, schools, community centers, and any gathering spaces. New York City has already announced additional resources deployed to Hanukkah celebrations and synagogues. Los Angeles police have committed to extra patrols. This is the reality Jewish communities now face, not just in Australia but globally. The question of how long this heightened security posture must be maintained, and at what cost both financial and psychological, is one we must confront honestly. Third, the political response in Australia will be swift and multifaceted. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has already convened the National Security Committee. He has called this an act of evil, antisemitism, and terrorism that struck the heart of the nation. The language is unequivocal. But language must be followed by action. We can anticipate several policy discussions emerging from this tragedy. There will be renewed examination of Australia's already strict gun control laws. Australia is often held up as a model for gun regulation. Following the 1996 Port Arthur massacre that killed 35 people, Australia implemented comprehensive gun reforms, including mandatory buybacks and strict licensing. Gun deaths in Australia are among the lowest in the developed world. Yet despite these measures, these attackers obtained firearms and executed a mass casualty event. This will prompt uncomfortable questions. Were these weapons obtained illegally through criminal networks? Were there gaps in enforcement? Could any policy have prevented this? The political discourse around these questions will be intense and likely polarized. There will be examination of intelligence and counter-terrorism capabilities. Australian authorities have been tracking a surge in anti-Semitic incidents since the beginning of the Gaza conflict. Synagogues torched. Businesses vandalized. Individuals attacked. In August, Prime Minister Albanese blamed Iran for 2 attacks and severed diplomatic ties with Tehran. Jewish community leaders and Israeli officials have repeatedly warned that Australia was not taking the threat seriously enough. Israeli President Isaac Herzog stated that they had warned the Australian government repeatedly about the need to uproot spreading antisemitism. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar went further, calling this the result of an anti-Semitic rampage in Australian streets over the past 2 years and criticizing the government's response. These criticisms will resonate within segments of the Australian public and will create pressure on the government. Questions will be asked. Were warning signs missed? Was there intelligence that could have prevented this? Were resources allocated appropriately to protect vulnerable communities? The government's ability to demonstrate that it took threats seriously and acted appropriately will be scrutinized intensely. There will also be a broader reckoning with anti-Semitism in Australian society. This is perhaps the most difficult and necessary conversation. Australia has experienced what Jewish community leaders describe as an unprecedented wave of anti-Semitic incidents since October 2023. The statistics are alarming. The testimonies are harrowing. Jewish Australians report feeling unsafe in their own country. Children are afraid to wear identifying symbols. Families are reconsidering their futures in Australia. We must ask ourselves difficult questions. How did we arrive at a point where a Hanukkah celebration at a public beach required such concern for safety that it ultimately proved insufficient? What have been the contributing factors? Certainly, the conflict in Gaza has intensified emotions and divisions. Legitimate criticism of Israeli government policies exists and should be protected as free speech. But there is a line, and that line has been crossed repeatedly. When protests feature calls for violence, when rhetoric dehumanizes, when individuals are targeted not for their political views but for their identity, we have entered dangerous territory. Israeli officials have pointed to slogans like, "Globalize the Intifada," and, "From the river to the sea," as contributing to a climate that ultimately produces violence. The Australian National Imams Council has condemned the shooting unequivocally, calling for unity and rejecting violence in all forms. This is important and must be acknowledged. But we also need broader societal reflection on how heated political discourse can create environments where some individuals feel violence is justified or inevitable. The implications for Australia's Jewish community are profound and tragic. There are approximately 120,000 Jews in Australia, with 85% living in Sydney and Melbourne. This is a community that has contributed immeasurably to Australian society across every field: science, arts, business, medicine, public service. It is a community that has felt increasingly vulnerable over the past 14 months. This attack will compound that sense of vulnerability exponentially. We can expect several responses from within the community. Some families will reconsider their future in Australia. There may be increased emigration to Israel or other countries where Jewish populations are larger and security infrastructure more developed. This would be a loss for Australia, both demographically and in terms of the contributions this community makes. There will be increased insularity as a protective measure. Communities may become more closed, more suspicious of outsiders, more reluctant to engage in public celebrations and visible expressions of identity. This is tragic because it represents a diminishment of the open, multicultural society Australia aspires to be. There will also likely be increased political activism within the Jewish community. Demands for stronger government action. Pressure for law enforcement to take threats more seriously. Advocacy for policy changes. This is legitimate and necessary, but it also introduces new tensions into an already fractured political landscape. The international implications are significant as well. This attack will reverberate throughout global Jewish communities. Hanukkah celebrations are happening worldwide right now. Every community will be evaluating their security. Every family will be considering whether it is safe to gather publicly. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. The message terrorists seek to send is that Jews are not safe anywhere, that celebrations of Jewish identity invite violence, that retreat and invisibility are the only paths to safety. Allowing that message to prevail would be a catastrophic failure. Israel has already responded with sharp criticism of the Australian government. The relationship between Israel and Australia will be tested. Australia has historically been a strong supporter of Israel while also maintaining that legitimate criticism of policy is appropriate. navigating this balance will become more difficult. Israeli officials will press for stronger action against antisemitism. They will point to this attack as validation of their warnings. The Australian government will need to demonstrate that it is taking concrete steps while also maintaining that it acts based on evidence and law, not external pressure. The United States will be watching closely. President Trump's immediate message to those celebrating Hanukkah was to do so proudly and without fear. The FBI's engagement indicates American security interests. Australia is a key ally in the Indo-Pacific region, and instability or internal tensions in Australia have implications for American strategic interests. There may be increased cooperation on counterterrorism, intelligence sharing, and efforts to combat extremist ideologies. Now let us consider longer-term trajectories and scenarios. There are several possible directions this could take, and the choices made in the coming weeks and months will be determinative. Scenario 1. Australia implements comprehensive reforms that successfully address both the immediate security concerns and the underlying social tensions. This would require several elements. First, demonstrable improvement in intelligence and law enforcement capabilities specifically focused on anti-Semitic threats. Second, serious engagement with the factors that have allowed antisemitism to flourish. This means addressing hate speech that crosses the line from political criticism to incitement. It means confronting extremism in whatever communities it arises. It means education and dialogue. Third, visible support for the Jewish community not just in words but in resources and policy. And fourth, maintenance of Australia's commitment to multiculturalism and pluralism while making clear that tolerance of diversity does not mean tolerance of hatred. If these elements come together, Australia could emerge from this tragedy with stronger social cohesion, clearer boundaries around acceptable discourse, and a renewed commitment to protecting all communities. This is the optimistic scenario. It is possible, but it requires political courage and sustained effort. Scenario 2. The response is primarily performative, and underlying issues remain unaddressed. Security is increased at Jewish sites, but the broader climate that enabled this attack persists. Political leaders make statements, but concrete action is limited. Investigations focus narrowly on the individuals involved without examining the ecosystem that radicalized them. In this scenario, the Jewish community remains vulnerable, tensions continue to simmer, and Australia faces the risk of future attacks. This would be a profound failure and would likely accelerate Jewish emigration and deepen communal divisions. Scenario 3. The political response itself becomes polarized and divisive, making the situation worse rather than better. In this scenario, the attack becomes weaponized in partisan conflicts. Some use it to push for restrictions on immigration or to target Muslim communities broadly. Others minimize the anti-Semitic dimension and frame it primarily through other lenses. The Jewish community becomes a political football. This would compound the tragedy and create new cycles of tension and potential violence. We must guard vigilantly against this scenario. Scenario 4. This attack is part of a broader pattern, and we see additional incidents targeting Jewish communities in Australia or elsewhere. If investigations reveal that the attackers were part of a network, if there are copycat incidents, if the security response proves insufficient, we could enter a period of sustained crisis. This would have dramatic implications for Jewish communities worldwide and would require international coordination on counter-terrorism efforts. What should be done? Let me offer some thoughts on the path forward, recognizing that I speak only as an observer attempting to think through these complex issues. First, the investigation must be thorough, transparent, and followed wherever the evidence leads. If there are international connections, they must be exposed. If there are domestic networks that enabled or encouraged these attackers, they must be dismantled. If there were failures in intelligence or prevention, they must be acknowledged and corrected. Second, there must be zero tolerance for antisemitism, just as there must be zero tolerance for any form of racism or religious hatred. This means clear legal boundaries and consistent enforcement. It means distinguishing carefully between legitimate political speech and incitement to violence. It means holding accountable those who cross that line, regardless of their claimed motivations. Third, security measures must be both effective and sustainable. Jewish communities cannot live in a permanent state of siege. While immediate enhanced security is necessary and appropriate, The long-term goal must be a society where such measures are less necessary, not more. Fourth, there must be honest, difficult conversations about antisemitism in Australia and globally. Why has it surged so dramatically since October 2023? What are the multiple factors contributing? How do political conflicts in the Middle East translate into violence against Jewish communities thousands of miles away? How do we maintain space for legitimate political disagreement while preventing it from metastasizing into hatred? Fifth, community dialogue and bridge building, even in the midst of tragedy and anger, remain essential. The statement from the Australian National Imams Council condemning this attack is important. There must be more such voices, from every community, making clear that violence against anyone based on their identity is unacceptable and will be opposed by all. Sixth, support for the victims and their families must be comprehensive and sustained. The physical wounds will heal for some. The psychological trauma will last much longer. The grief will be permanent. Communities must come together to support those affected. Seventh, the Jewish community's fears and concerns must be heard and validated. When community leaders say they feel unsafe, when families say their children are frightened, when individuals say they are reconsidering their futures in Australia, these are not abstract political statements. These are real human experiences that demand serious response. Finally, we must remember what was being celebrated when this attack occurred. Hanukkah commemorates the rededication of the Temple in Jerusalem after a period of persecution and the miracle of light enduring against odds. It is a story of resilience, of faith maintained in difficult circumstances, of small lights pushing back darkness. The terrorist calculus is always to make the light seem too dangerous to kindle. The appropriate response is to ensure that the lights burn brighter. In the immediate hours and days ahead, we will learn more about the attackers, their motivations, their connections. We will see how Australian authorities respond operationally and politically. We will watch how the Jewish community and the broader Australian society process this trauma. But the fundamental question we face is not new, even if this particular manifestation is shocking. The question is whether pluralistic democracies can protect minority communities effectively while maintaining their essential character as open, free societies. Whether we can have difficult political conversations without them spiraling into hatred. Whether we can maintain both security and liberty, both vigilance and trust. The 11 people who lost their lives at Bondi Beach deserve to celebrate their holiday in safety and joy. The 29 wounded deserve to gather with their community without fear. The children who witnessed this violence deserve to experience Hanukkah as a time of wonder and light, not terror and death. We owe it to them, and to the principles we claim to uphold, to ensure that the response to this attack makes Australia and the world safer and more just, not more divided and afraid. This will require the best of us. It will require moral courage. It will require resisting the easy answers and the divisive narratives. It will require holding multiple truths simultaneously, that we must be tough on terrorism and extremism while also being thoughtful about root causes, that we must protect Jewish communities while also protecting civil liberties for all, that we must acknowledge legitimate grievances about conflicts abroad while making clear that they can never justify violence at home. The path forward is difficult, but it is not impossible. It starts with unequivocal condemnation of this attack and all forms of anti-Semitic violence. It continues with serious policy responses informed by evidence and expertise. And it requires a sustained commitment to the values that define democratic, pluralistic societies: equality, dignity, freedom of religion, and the fundamental principle that every person, regardless of their identity, has the right to live without fear. What happened at Bondi Beach yesterday was an attempt to spread darkness, to replace light with fear, to substitute terror for joy. Our task now is to ensure that attempt fails. Not just through security measures, though those are necessary. Not just through investigations and prosecutions, though those are essential. But through a reaffirmation of our commitment to the kind of society where a Hanukkah celebration at a beach is simply what it should be: a community gathering in joy to mark their traditions and pass their heritage to the next generation. That is the Australia worth fighting for. That is the world worth building. And that must be the ultimate outcome of this tragedy. Not retreat, not division, not surrender to those who would make us afraid of each other, but renewed dedication to protecting every community's right to exist openly, proudly, and safely.